what is Śānta Yoga? And actually probably why Śānta Yoga? We know already there's no shortage of yoga systems in the modern world, and those of you that practice with me, that join me for practice, hear me talk about the many different expressions of yoga, you know. And we consider yoga to be like a language, like an ongoing open dialogue. It expresses itself from east to west, west to east, in many different ways. You know, we see modern systems and approaches that place quite heavy focus on the asana, the postural practice, if you like, on pranayama. And then equally, in other parts of the world, we see heavy focus on the more ritualistic, maybe dogmatic or religious practices that can be associated with yoga and its roots as well, and yogic philosophy, spiritualism, Hinduism, Buddhism, all of that. So, you know, across the world there are many different expressions of yoga, and despite, you know, all attempts to kind of monopolise or claim ownership of, or you know, argue to and fro as to what yoga is and what it isn't, one thing always rings clear, that there's no kind of final absolute answer on the matter. And instead that yoga seems to have this expression that fortunately aspires to evolve with the modern world, and that much is clear. So despite the fact that we know we've got all of these systems and methods or approaches, understandings, interpretations in place, why then do we need another one? Which is a very valid question. You know, every tradition does offer its own language or its own version, its own emphasis even, and methods, of course. You know, and you know, the difference between those methods, maybe the variety actually between those methods, gives us different angles from which we can approach our practice, right? You know, so whether it be postural emphasis or devotion, whether it be the kind of breath work that it's quite often referred to, especially here in the Western world, or the philosophy, meditation, disciplined inquiry, so on and so forth. They all offer different systems, but Śānta Yoga doesn't seek to kind of necessarily emulate, or more relevantly, actually doesn't seek to replace any of them, nor does it claim to be the only path, you know. This system rather begins with simple observation. So as opposed to the heavy emphasis being, and we talk about this a lot at the beginning of the practice, but as opposed to the heavy emphasis being on one of those key points, it is instead, from the word go, on observation, arrival and observation, you know, being present, and being present enough to be able to observe honestly and quietly. And so beneath the diversity of yoga and across all of those yoga systems and the yoga traditions, there seems to be a common kind of aspiration with which Śānta Yoga also aligns, and that is to know ourselves, right, more deeply, is to reduce suffering, and you know, the kind of hold and the shackle that has, you know, attached itself, you know, to ourself, to the ego, to the self, to the many versions of the self, you know, and that I suppose that aspiration in that sense is to live in a greater harmony, you know, with the world around us and internally as well. So both externally and internally. And so my experience really has been, you know, throughout the many expressions of yoga, that there's this underlying principle that quietly kind of connects all of those foundations, or not foundations, but all of those systems, and that really this is kind of my attempt to articulate that principle, I would suppose, and offer a practical way to sort of to approach it through practice, right? So we have, on which we'll touch on momentarily, but we have the quiet body method, which forms part of the backbone, if you like, of the Śānta Yoga system, which we'll go into greater detail about in just a moment. But the system as a whole is, I guess, another interpretation, but a more modern way to practically approach this kind of unifying principle that through experience seems to be observable. So, I mean, initially, through many years of practice, many thousands of hours of practice and teaching, one of the biggest things that seems to have arisen is this kind of common problem as well that we face, and that we're all presented with, and that seems to interfere actually and hinder our practice quite often, and that's the way that modern life is so overstimulating, you know, and so fragmenting with regards to our attention. You know, our attention's always divided, always split in so many different ways. We're constantly moving between, you know, identities and roles, whether it be in a professional sense or in terms of our ambitions or expectations that we have of ourselves or that others have of us. You know, we're constantly pulled from pillar to post, and even in moments of stillness, our minds continue to race all the time. We're always thinking about the past or the future, you know, and so in that way we've become accustomed to living through this kind of habitual sense of being on autopilot all the time, rather than through awareness and through presence, you know. And so we spend most of our time instead of in relationship to the present moment, we seem to be, it's my chickens in the background, we seem to be in reaction, like I just did, to these stimuli and to all this overstimulation, you know. And we talk about in much more detail in the Quiet Body Method and in the Quiet Body Method program, you know, the way that we digest information in the same way that we need time to digest food that we consume. We're constantly consuming information as well, and you know, experiencing this sensory consumption, right? And we very rarely take time to digest all of those stimuli, and so in a similar way, you know, we spend most of our time bouncing like we're in a pinball machine from one stimuli to the next, from one expectation to the next, from one demand or duty or responsibility to the next, with very little time to stop and be present and take stock and, you know, and to be attentive to everything, you know, both internally and externally, right? Not reactive, that's something else. And so the aim in that sense has become, of Śānta Yoga, or has emerged rather, for us not to escape the world, but to meet it sort of differently to the way that we already do, instead of in reaction to it, you know, maybe with more emphasis on being present and in relationship to it, you know. So it asks whether beneath all of this activity there's a much quieter way and a much more honest, therefore, way of experiencing life and living, actually living. You know, instead of, you know, living for tomorrow or living through the past, the lens of the past, you know, living now, here, right? So, and that kind of stillness, that quiet away, that stillness that lies beneath it all, is not something that we cultivate. It's something that's always there. It's always been there, and it's something that we can unfold and release through unfolding the layers of the self through our practice, you know, and shedding the many images that we have of the self. Like we say, these, you know, I'm an employee, I'm a son, I'm a father, I'm a brother, I'm a husband, and so on and so forth. Once we strip away those layers, we expose the raw thing that lies beneath, this constant thing that lies beneath. There's a sense of, it can be experienced, there's a sense of quietness, a sense of stillness, a sense of quietude, inner quietude, you know. There's a kind of honest presence that's unchanging, as opposed to the self and the body and the upper layers of our existence, of our entity, that seems to be in a constant state paradoxically, of change and transformation all the time, right? And that's the central proposition actually of the Śānta Yoga system, is that stillness is something that already exists beneath. It's not something that we cultivate. It's something that's there already, you know. So just as the surface of a lake can be disturbed during turbulent weather, you know, high winds and rain, and you know the water's splashing and waves are crashing here, there, and everywhere, and there are ripples all over the place. You know, the depths of that lake can remain calm and still, you know, and silent. And in the same way, beneath our thoughts and our emotions and our reactions to the world, you know, our identities, our roles, all of that, there exists this awareness that's never entirely lost. It's always there. It's always subtly there beneath the surface, you know. And it's something that we can kind of tap into. And without sounding cliche or woo-woo, it's this I have experienced through a great deal of practice and observation, you know, and you can too. And so I think that quiet awareness, it's despite all of this distraction and all of this fragmentation, it's something that has never been entirely lost. It's been present, you know, throughout the journey of mankind over the millennia. And I think many traditions describe that thing, that tangible constant, that singular pointed kind of consciousness that resides below the surface. They describe that in different ways, right? You know, we've heard terminology like pure awareness and divinity, consciousness, the witness, Atma, you know, the immortal soul, Brahman, which is, you know, the oneness, the entirety of all existence, all creation, you know, or simply presence, just, you know, a divine presence. However we describe it, the words don't really matter, do they? But rather the experience itself and knowing what that is, if such a thing is even possible. Not getting too lost with the implication of the word to know, right? And the ideas surrounding, you know, one's capacity to conceive something and to know something. It's not, we don't need to over-intellectualise, actually, which is something that we often do, and that also enshrouds and kind of frames experience through a lens. So the Śānta Yoga system offers us, or promises us, and reveals to us this stillness that's beneath, and a method to kind of work towards that, you know. And so this is why kind of practice is necessary in one way, shape or form. Because if that stillness we know is already there, why practice at all, right? Why do we need to even bother? If it's there, we just tap into it, right? But I think consistently recognising it requires or demands that we cultivate, and we must cultivate a certain frame of mind, state of mind and state of body, right? So it's not just mind, it's the body of mind, manamaya, but you know, through the layers of our being, we have to cultivate a certain a state of being for us to refine our awareness enough to unfold, to blossom and experience this pure consciousness, this divinity, this quietude, this stillness that resides beneath, this harmony, right? And so I think this is where the Śānta Yoga system differs actually in emphasis, because the classical texts describe qualities such as self-study and concentration, equanimity, meditation, focus, all of that, you know, the Kshatriya as well, cleansing and all of this. Often actually with remarkable wisdom and clarity, they really do. You know, and so in that way, those sort of systems themselves illuminate the destination really well. But I think it kind of leaves open the practical question actually of how, especially in the modern world, because these are ancient systems, how modern practitioners, you know, modern yogis, if you like, would cultivate these qualities in daily life in the modern world, right? And that's where the Śānta Yoga system offers, you know, one possible answer, and it's not the only, of course, and it's certainly not the answer, but it's a method and approach. It's a progressive sort of discipline, if you like. Ironically, you know, we need to encapsulate ourselves and shackle ourselves and bind ourselves to a repetitive practice, ironically, to then liberate ourselves and become free of the confines and the restrictions of dogmatic behaviour, right, and structured, organised behaviour. So there's a kind of interesting irony, or I suppose, humour to it. But that's the world, that's life, right? And so this system offers that kind of, one possible answer, or one possible approach, which is that practitioners can refine their attention through embodied experience rather than the abstract philosophies that we might see attached or to more traditional understandings or systems or approaches to yoga practice and meditation and so on and so forth. And so through, or as part of the underlying backbone or practical expression of the Śānta Yoga or Śānta Yoga system, is the quiet body method, which you've all heard me talking quite a lot about, and we will go into much more detail in the program when eventually that launches. I'm still working on it. It's all emerging at the moment. So that is the quiet body method. And so the quiet body method isn't just something to stretch, or to strengthen. It's not a exclusively postural approach to yoga practice. It's not just a bit of breath work and letting go and releasing trauma and all of this sort of stuff. Instead, it's more of an instrument of observation, right? Primarily, it's an instrument of observation. And so each posture, each transition, each breath, each movement, it becomes this opportunity for the practitioner, for us, to observe and to be aware, to be extraordinarily aware, right? And to study our relationship between sensation, between thought, between emotion, attention, energy, to look at the layers of our entity, to observe it with profound honesty, without the usual labels that we apply to ourselves, whether it be, I used to be able to do this, or I used to be able to do that, or, I want to be able to do this or do that, or achieve this, achieve that, feel this, feel that. When we let go of all of that, through following the quiet body method, which helps us to do that, exactly that, for us to step away from those stencils or templates that we try to squeeze ourselves into, those labels that we attach to ourselves, those little domes that we place over ourselves to contain our being. When we move away from that and we shed those shackles, which is exactly what they are, it leaves this space, it cultivates this space for us to then be profoundly aware, for us to be incredibly attentive to the relationship that we have to sensation and to thought, and the way that we react to thought, and the stimuli as they arise, as they come and go, and thoughts as they come and go, feelings as they come and go. And so through the four pillars, the four main practices of the quiet body, as we kind of ascend, and don't get lost with the word ascend being above or higher or any of this nonsense, but as we ascend through the progression, the krama, the steps of the practice, and the five, as opposed, if the practices were vertical, then the gateways of the quiet body method would be horizontal in theory, right? As we through each practice, we move through the gateways independently during each practice, and that will make sense to you when you start to dive into the quiet body method. Our awareness is progressively refined. We're kind of sharpening the blade of our awareness, honing it even, and so the practice becomes, when we do that, it becomes increasingly subtle. And we know that already. Something I talk about quite a lot is, I think many of us find it particularly easy to observe the physical bodies. Oh, my knee hurts, right? I'm aware of pain in my knee. And so I'm not going to try to do Virabhadra, Warrior 3 on that side, because putting all my weight, particularly if I twist very slightly, it really hurts my knee, so I'm not going to do that. But then when we start to look a little deeper and look at the way energetically, the way that we feel when we breathe, and not just breathing as a function, but at the expression of the breath, you know, the way that intelligently expresses itself throughout the energetic body, you know, the way that we rise and we lift and there's a spiralling up when we take a very deliberate, very intentional, conscious inhalation, and the way that we sink and the way that we feel grounding and the almost embrace that we feel when we exhale and we constrict and we release all of the breath, you know, that takes a more subtle awareness, a more refined awareness, you know. And so through the postures, through the pranayama, you know, through the breath work that we do, through regular practice and following these gateways, and the gateways is the how-to part in this equation, right? We progressively refine our attention and we become aware or more aware, and we begin to notice things that were previously overlooked, you know, and that might be, you know, unnecessary effort, you know, so being driven by the ego to push for certain postures or push to achieve, or for a sense of achievement, just as it is actually, or a sense of growth, and moving away from what is through a desire for what could be, you know, or moving away from what was through a lack of acceptance, you know, for what has become. And so there's this resistance, right? And that can be a resistance energetically or emotionally, but there can be physical resistance as well, you know, where the body resists. And we might not be aware that we're doing it. And that's why we start with the body. When we work through the koshas, the pancha koshas, the 5 sheaths, the 5 shells of our body as a multi-faceted, multi-dimensional entity, not just this physical container thing. When we move through those, you know, we can see, even at the surface level, in our physical body, we resist certain things. Oh, that hurts. I'm stretching too deeply, so I'm going to tense my legs up and squeeze my thighs together to avoid going deeper into the split, for example, you know, because it hurts, and I need to protect, you know, I need to protect myself, you know, my ligaments, my tendons, my muscles. And so there's some of us aren't aware that we do that, but we can learn to become aware when we do it, you know, and it's the gateways and the pillars of practice that will help us get to that point, you know. And so it might be unconscious effort, it might be unconscious or unnecessary effort, unconscious tension, you know, that resistance, that tension in the body. It might be, you know, habitual reactions to certain stimuli, the way that we react to certain stimuli, things that are said and done, or feelings, you know, that even a feeling as a result of a position that we go into during our practice, or a certain, you know, even just the way that we might be guided to breathe or something like that during our practice, can elicit an emotional response, which then can become a stimuli, in a sense, and cause a chain effect where we then change the way that we practice, and it affects our relationship to the body, you know, during the practice, and the layers of the body, you know. And so in that sense, the way that our attention throughout our practice kind of fluidly moves can be influenced and can change as well without our awareness, you know, without us being aware of that. So we need to make sure that during our practice, through the process of the quiet body, through the method of the quiet body, that we have in mind this honest observation of all of it, all of the above, right? And that's where kind of clearer awareness comes into play, through observation and through honest observation. So, going back to it, the Śānta Yoga system doesn't, and this is an important point for me to mention here, it doesn't supersede or seek to replace classical yoga systems, right, or philosophy. Actually, it draws from them quite heavily. It stands firmly on those foundations, actually. You know, and I think at the base of those are the Sutra of Patanjali and the Yamas and Niyamas, particularly the Yamas and Niyamas. They're very important in the Śānta Yoga system, because we need to again, we need to cultivate a state of mind that makes it possible for us to progress with the rest of the system and with the quiet body methodology. And that should make sense, because if one was living a life of conflict, right, and bouncing from pillar to post through addictions and abusive relationships and what have you, the state of mind doesn't exist for one to fully dedicate themselves to practice, right? That seems obvious. And so one of the ways that we can achieve that and cultivate that state of mind and body is through observation of the yamas and the niyamas, the internal and the external observances. And don't worry if you don't know what they are, we will go into those later on. But they're one of the primary foundations for the framework that makes up the Śānta Yoga system, and they're obviously drawn from classical yoga texts and yogic philosophy. Svadhyaya is another one as well, self-study, which we've touched on quite a lot already, and that becomes more than just reading sacred texts. It's the ongoing study of our own behaviour, our conditioning, and the way that we react to things, and our behavioural patterns as well, actually. So obviously stimulus and response, action and reaction, and observing ourselves. Almost, you could probably tie it to like CBT. Some of us might have experienced cognitive behavioural therapy and learning, to change the way that we manage, how we cope, change and employ different coping mechanisms to the different stimuli of an ever-changing and ever-demanding and overstimulating world, right? Pranitana is another one, or Ishvara Pranitana, which is surrender to the divine, as it's most commonly translated and interpreted. But it doesn't just mean surrendering to, a big floating bearded man in the sky that throws lightning bolts when he's angry, right? It's less about adopting a particular theology or rigorous religious practice. With the Śānta Yoga system, and much more about surrendering the illusion of complete control, surrendering to something that's greater, and allowing ourselves to participate more fully, more honestly in living, in being present, And so really surrendering to the present, surrendering to now, surrendering to that which is. And that which is, we can label however we want to, Mother Nature or God or the universe or whatever we might, So that's another kind of key classical yoga principle or philosophy that is employed. And these are all, from the older yoga texts that were interpreted later on by Patanjali and put into the Yoga Sutra of Patanjali, from the original Raja Yoga Sutra, right? Prana is another one as well, the energetic body and the way that energy moves throughout the body. And it's something that we'll explore not merely as a kind of an idea or a function, but as a living experience that's felt through breath. Like breath is the vessel, prana is what's contained and carried by it, So breath is the function really. But the expression is something that we feel as prana, as this movement of energy and this attentive presence, that changes, is in a state of transformation too, right? So in this way, philosophy becomes quite embodied within the Śānta Yoga system, as opposed to something that we might intellectually embody or intellectually understand, And that's kind of one of the things that makes it distinct, really, and quite unique, is that Śānta Yoga doesn't aim to invent new postures or take a claim somewhere exclusively with regards to accessing some sort of ancient wisdom or something like that. Its uniqueness is in the quality of the attention that the practice, the system cultivates, and that does make it quite unique. because that you know, many practices ask us to perform movements, but Śānta asks us to observe the one that's moving, you know, the one that's breathing, the one that's feeling, the one that's doing. You know, Hatha, Ashtanga, Vinyasa, with regards to meditation, you know, they teach us in various ways to meditate. Well, this is meditation. This is part of how you meditate, you know. But almost as a separate practice, right? But through Śānta, we gradually transform so that every movement within the practice becomes meditation. You know, that the whole system is meditation. It's meditative. You know, the process that we follow, the movement through the 5 gateways, through each of the 4 pillars of practice, is a meditation. It's not something that we do after the fact, you know. It's something that happens fluidly throughout. And so in that sense, presence isn't this kind of reward that waits at the end. The stillness, the oneness, isn't this thing that we finally uncover afterwards. It is the practice itself. That's what it is, you know, and our relationship to it, with it, as it, the embodiment of it, and the unfolding of the layers of the self and the layers of the body, and the kind of reconstruction of the basis that facilitates and not cultivates, but that facilitates our ability to observe it and be present enough and attentive and aware enough to observe it, if that makes sense. Hopefully it does. I think what we discover throughout our practice, it's important to notice and be aware of what we might discover as well. And with sustained practice, initially it is, you know, we are aware of alignment, we're aware of the postures, we're aware of our breath, excuse me, we're aware of the way that we feel in reaction to certain positions. You know, oh, this hurts, that hurts, I need to work on that to, you know, be able to get deeper or get further or become stronger, and so on and so forth. But eventually, following the method and with sustained practice within the system, you know, we become less reactive and much more responsive, and our body kind of softens, and we become more intuitive in the way that we practice. You know, more led by feeling, and by an almost instinctive approach to our practice, as opposed to constantly fighting resistance. You know, oh, I need to go deeper in my warrior 2 and, you know, have a much wider position and sink with the, you know, bring my root closer to the floor and reach up longer with the arms, and there's this kind of resistance. The body resists that. We have to fight against it. Why doesn't it lengthen by itself? Why doesn't it sink by itself? And physiologically, we're talking on the surface level, but equally below, there's a resistance too, you know. The mind fights in Shavasana, in the corpse, the body pose, you know, at the end. We ask the body to be still. A fly lands on your arm and there's a resistance. The body says, oh, but there's this thing, you know, and instinctively it's, oh, it might bite me. It might do me harm or damage. So our attention's drawn to it. And we know it's just a fly, it'll probably be fine. Oh, but it's an intruder and it's disturbing us. So we react, we move, you know, it tickles, or it, even if it does bite us, there's a disturbance and there's a reaction, you know, there's this, we're perturbed, aren't we? And the same happens with the mind. The mind dances from thought to thought, you know, from this to that, and it's in this constant state of this or that, which is conflict, obviously. And where there's conflict, there's no harmony, there's no stillness, you know. And so, in the same way, there's a resistance, right? We resist. We don't deliberately resist, but the mind resists, the body resists, all of the layers of our being resist. That's where discernment, that's where Vijnanamaya is important, you know, the body of wisdom. We have to see and know and truly understand through quiet observation that we aren't our thoughts, we aren't the physical body, we are something beneath all of that, you know. And that in some way those things contain what lies beneath, or at least cover it. And so, you know, the body in that sense kind of becomes softer, it softens to the practice, and the breath too. You know, it becomes more, not autonomous, but more instinctive, or more natural, for lack of a better word, more intuitive and more automatic, you know, with our movements. That's not, don't be lost with that. I don't necessarily mean in a vinyasa sense, you know, inhale up, exhale down, but it becomes something that we use much more readily and intuitively to kind of transport us and cultivate a stillness of the mind, you know, towards and cultivate a stillness of the mind. And in that way, you know, we're able to experience a sense of compassion and gratitude, I suppose, much more deeply and much more naturally, because our awareness expands, right? You know, it's more refined, but it expands, you know, beyond these limitations that kind of pre-exist for all of us. You know, so this kind of search initially for a sense of higher self or a better self gradually gives way to something much more simple and much more important, which is recognising that beneath the change in personality, there's this kind of awareness, this constant, this single-pointed awareness that's never been broken. It's never changed. You know, it's been there the whole time. Everyone is in a constant state of transformation at the surface, but beneath, it's this you know, this mud from which the lotus blooms. You know, and that mud, that primordial earth, is there, and it has been all along. You know, harbouring, containing, and giving birth, and allowing everything at the surface to bloom in all its frenzy and beautiful, chaotic nature. All right, hopefully you still follow. So, yeah, the Śānta Yoga system helps us to understand that and helps to reveal that. You know, it doesn't promise some deep enlightening revelation. You know, it doesn't promise enlightenment as such, but rather an honest exploration of our experience of living. You know, and that's kind of in a way in the modern world, I think that's a very appropriate aspiration for yoga to express itself in that way, because it doesn't ask anyone to adopt a belief, you know. And I think there's lots of, you know, one of my students at one point said, "Oh, Andy's a Hindu, Andy's this, Andy's that." Andy's not. Andy's all sorts of things, and none of those things are real. They're all just images. They're all just versions of Andy, manifestations, right? Without being too funky or over-intellectualising or going too spiritual, philosophical about it, you know. This is what someone said, Andy's a Hindu, so he would think that. Whereas Andy doesn't want anyone to be a Hindu or adopt a belief. Actually, the term Hinduism we can get lost with and talk about how regional, it's a regional term that applies to people that observe certain practices and cultural behaviours and whatnot. Commonly, we might understand it that way. So it's definitely something not to get lost with. But Śānta Yoga doesn't doesn't ask you to adopt, you know, any sort of particular belief or any set of practices or behaviours or whatever. It just asks you to practice, that's all. Just practice and observe, like see it for yourself. Don't believe me and what I'm telling you, you know. Do the practice, take the journey, experience what the journey holds, and then decide for yourself, you know. Just make sure you allow yourself to be curious when you do that. You know, discover for yourselves what becomes possible, you know, when you take that step, and when the body eventually grows quiet and awareness becomes clear. Like it reveals itself. It's not something that you say, "Oh, yeah, that's right, Andy, we believe you," you know. Andy's telling the truth. But rather, see it for yourself. You know, go into the practice, go into yourself, inquire, observe the way that you behave, observe the things that drive you, not just. And this is equally where Śānta Yoga is quite unique, because it's not just limited to yogic practice as we might initially understand it. You know, the postures, the breathwork, and all of that. This is a mindset, an approach to understanding daily life, to living, to your entire life. Something that you can employ from morning to evening, through every waking moment, you know. And the quiet body as a method is the beginning of that journey. It's the beginning, it's a practice that we can employ to help us get there. And for those, obviously, that wish to go further into the quiet body and explore further, and explore the wider Śānta Yoga system as well, there'll be a much deeper immersion into the philosophy and the practices, the progressive stages, and you know, all of the kind of ideology that exists beneath it and around it. We'll be able to dive into that and immerse ourselves on upcoming retreats, at the practice events, and the workshops, and the advanced kind of study and online study programs that I'll be launching in the near future. And you're all invited, you know. And that invitation is quite simple, actually. You know, don't accept these ideas, I'll say it again, because they sound beautiful or idealistic or what have you, or because I'm saying them, but test them to experience, you know, put it into play yourself, you know. Learn the quiet body method, and the Śānta Yoga system will reveal itself, you know. And I think that's the best place to conclude as well. You know, experience, rather than belief, as opposed to asking you to believe something. Experiencing it for yourself will always be the most honest teacher, always.